Mr. Arthur Penhaligon was a creature of habit, and his habits were as plain and grey as the London fog that so often crept past his window. He lived by himself in a small, tidy flat on the third floor of a very ordinary building. His days were measured not in hours, but in cups of tea and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. He had no wife, no children, and his only companion was a rather sullen-looking goldfish named Winston, who did little more than stare back at him from its small glass bowl. Arthur's life was a perfectly straight line, with no bumps, no curves, and certainly no surprises. He liked it that way, or so he told himself every morning as he buttoned his perfectly ironed shirt. The strangeness began on a Monday. When Arthur woke, he glanced at his telephone, a simple black device that sat on his bedside table. The little screen was lit up, showing 3 missed calls. This was unusual in itself, as no one ever called Arthur, especially not at such an early hour. But what made his blood run a little cold was the number displayed on the screen. It was his own number. He stared at it for a long time, turning the phone over in his hand, as if it were a peculiar insect. He thought it must be a glitch, a strange trick of the wires. He dismissed it, cleared the notification, and went about his morning routine of toast, marmalade, and weak tea. The next morning it happened again. 3 missed calls, all logged in the dead of night, all from his own telephone number. A prickle of unease traced its way up Arthur's spine. He checked his call history, confirming he had not somehow dialed his own number in his sleep. The calls were real. They had come from somewhere outside his flat, yet they carried his own digital signature. It was a riddle with no answer, a locked door with no key. He felt a growing sense of being watched, a quiet, unseen presence that had found a way to reach him through the telephone line. It was a most unsettling feeling for a man who cherished his solitude. This peculiar pattern continued for the rest of the week. Every single morning, without fail, Arthur would wake to find the same 3 missed calls from his own number. He began to feel a strange sort of dread mixed with an undeniable curiosity. Who was calling him, and how were they using his number? The calls were always made between 3 and 4 in the morning, a time when the world was asleep and only secrets seemed to be awake. The silence of the calls was what unnerved him the most. There were never any voicemails, just the digital record of a connection that was never made. The mystery was a small stone in his shoe, a constant nagging irritation in his otherwise orderly life. After a full week of these silent phantom calls, Arthur's curiosity finally won its battle against his fear. He decided that the next morning he would be ready. He set his alarm for 2:50 in the morning, a truly ungodly hour. He sat up in his bed, the darkness of the room thick around him, and stared at the telephone with the intensity of a hunter watching its prey. The air was still and quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the city outside and the frantic thumping of his own heart. He felt a bit foolish sitting there in his pajamas, waiting for a ghost to call him. But he had to know. The not knowing was becoming far worse than any possible truth. At precisely 3:15, the telephone rang. Its shrill cry cut through the silence, making Arthur jump so violently he nearly knocked the device off the table. For a moment he just stared at it, the screen brightly displaying his own name and number. His hand trembled as he reached for it. This was it, the moment of truth. He took a deep, shaky breath, the kind you take before plunging into ice-cold water, and pressed the green button. He lifted the receiver to his ear, his throat suddenly dry. He said nothing, waiting for the caller to make the first move, his mind racing with 100 wild and impossible possibilities. "Hello?" he finally whispered, his voice barely audible. There was a pause on the other end of the line, filled with the crackle of static, like a voice traveling a very long way. Then a sound came through that made every hair on Arthur's body stand on end. It was a voice, and it was a voice he knew better than any other in the world. It was his own. It was a perfect copy, yet it sounded strained, panicked, and desperate. It was as if he were listening to an echo of himself, a version of him that had seen something terrible and was trying to claw its way back through time. The voice spoke again, and its message was short, sharp, and chilling. "Arthur," it rasped, the sound distorted and thin. "Don't go to work today. Whatever you do, Arthur, do not go to the office. Stay home, please. Just for today, stay home." Before Arthur could respond, before he could ask who this was or how this was possible, the line went dead. He was left holding the silent phone, the echo of his own panicked voice still ringing in his ears. The warning hung in the air, heavy and menacing, a dark cloud that had suddenly gathered over his perfectly ordinary day. He sat there in the dark, utterly bewildered and more than a little frightened. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale, watery light into his room, Arthur Penhaligon tried to reason with himself. The call had been a dream, surely. Or perhaps it was a prank, a very clever and cruel joke played by someone with too much time on their hands. How could he possibly have spoken to himself? It defied all logic, all reason, all the neat and tidy rules that governed his world. He was a sensible man, not one to be swayed by nightmares or flights of fancy. The voice had sounded so real, so full of genuine terror, but it simply could not be. To stay home from work based on such a thing would be madness. He made his breakfast, the toast tasting like cardboard in his mouth. He put on his suit, the familiar fabric feeling strange and foreign against his skin. Every step of his routine felt wrong, overshadowed by the memory of that desperate, disembodied voice. "Don't go to work today." The words played over and over in his mind like a broken record. He stood by the door, his hand on the knob, and hesitated. A powerful instinct, a deep primal feeling of dread, screamed at him to stay put, to lock the door, draw the curtains, and wait for the day to pass. But his rational mind, the part of him that paid bills and followed schedules, scoffed at the idea. With a sigh of frustration at his own foolishness, Arthur pulled the door open and stepped out into the hallway. He would not be controlled by a phantom. He would go to work, just as he did every other day. The journey to his office, a towering building of glass and steel in the city center, was unremarkable. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place, as if he were a ghost walking through a world that was no longer meant for him. He saw danger in every passing car, suspicion in the faces of strangers. The warning had planted a seed of fear in his heart, and it was growing with every step he took towards his destination. He was just a block away from the office when he heard it, a deafening roar that shook the very pavement beneath his feet. He looked up and saw a horrifying sight. Thick, black smoke was pouring from the windows of his building, from the very floor where his office was located. Flames, bright and orange, licked at the sky. People were screaming and running in every direction. Fire engines wailed in the distance, their sirens a soundtrack to the chaos. Arthur stood frozen, his briefcase slipping from his numb fingers. It was real. The fire was real. And the voice. The warning had been real too. He had been saved by an impossibility. The days that followed the fire were a blur for Arthur Penhaligon. The office was gone, reduced to a charred skeleton. He learned that the fire had started due to a catastrophic electrical fault right in his section of the building. Had he been at his desk at his usual time, he would not have survived. The thought sent a cold shiver through him every time it crossed his mind. The warning call was no longer a curious mystery. It was a terrifying miracle. It had saved his life. He could not explain it. He could not understand it. But he could not deny it. The voice from the future, his own voice, had reached back to keep him safe. Life, for Arthur, was now split into two distinct parts, the time before the call and the time after. The old Arthur, the man of predictable habits and unwavering routine, was gone. In his place was a man haunted by a question that had no answer. He no longer found comfort in his quiet, lonely flat. Instead, the silence seemed to be listening, waiting. He would sit for hours, just staring at the black telephone on his table, seeing it not as a simple machine, but as a portal, a direct line to his own destiny. He was consumed by the knowledge that somewhere in the future, a version of himself knew what was coming. The missed calls stopped. The phone remained silent each morning, its screen dark and blank. But Arthur could not rest. He began setting his alarm for 2:50 every single morning, just as he had on that fateful day. He would sit up in bed, his eyes fixed on the telephone, his body tense with anticipation. He was waiting for his own voice to call again, to offer another piece of guidance, another warning, another glimpse into the unknown. The fear he had once felt was now replaced by a desperate, gnawing need to know what would happen next. The call had become his only connection to a future he could not see. And so, every morning, in the deep, dark hours before the dawn, Mr. Arthur Penhaligon waits. He waits for the shrill ring that might never come again. He waits for the crackle of static and the sound of his own desperate voice traveling through time. He is no longer just a lonely man in a small flat. He is a watchman, a sentinel guarding a secret he can share with no one. He waits for the next message, the next warning, the next terrible event he might be called upon to avoid. He just sits there, alone in the dark, waiting for the future to call. And he wonders, with a dread that chills him to the bone, what disaster will it be next time?